name is familiar to all of you. He is, of course, the Member of Parliament for the North London constituency of Tottenham. He's also the Shadow Justice Secretary, who's one of the leading agenda setters in the fields of social activism, diversity and multiculturalism. So a welcome there to David Lammy, and the floor is now yours.
Well, hello, and thank you very much. And I guess the best place to start is in this moment, which is Black Lives Matter and the protests that we're seeing in the streets. And I want to start first with hope. And what fills me with hope at this moment is that when you look at the protesters, despite the huge concerns, of course, rightly there is about coronavirus, when you look at the protesters, they are largely millennials, largely Generation Y, and they are Black, of course, but there are many, many white young people amongst them. And actually, when you looked at the pulling down of that Colston statue and those that threw it into the water, they were largely young white men. And that fills you with hope, because when you listen to them, what they have is not just a passion and a determination, but for the first time in my 20 years in public life, they have an articulacy about the subject at hand. And so here comes the challenge, which is that in so many ways, and I've done so many events over the years, where we've arrived at in this moment, the banner of diversity and inclusion, the use of the term BAME doesn't really convey what is required on the bottle. Diversity is a sort of catch-all phrase that in terms of racial diversity can mean in so many organizations very little. And inclusion is desired, but a long way from delivered. And what Black Lives Matter is about is effectively challenging structural racism. Now, in my experience here in the UK, it of course has been the case for most of my life that people understand what racism is in its most simple and overt terms. They understand that if you use a racial slur like the N-word or the P-word if you're Asian, that is racist. They understand that if you're renting a house and a Black family turn up at the door to rent that house and you exclude them, that is racist. And they certainly understand in an employment setting if you dismiss someone and it attaches to race. But what they don't understand as well, and what I think we're seeing from across the pond in the United States, is a debate about structural racism. And structural racism is, of course, more than just the overt act. It is about saying that racism is something that began hundreds of years ago. It began here in Europe, not in the United States. It started first and foremost with a scientific racism, great names like Darwin, Dalton, and others, who came up with a pecking order. And it was a pecking order that allowed Britain and other countries in Europe to colonize much of the world. And frankly, as they came across Black and brown people, to put them in a box that was less than, such that you could have enslaved my ancestors. And it's, you know, as this is being talked about, I'm getting lots of messages. My wife is white, my children are mixed race, half my family is white, from folk who are not, I wouldn't describe them as progressive or liberal. For the first time hearing and listening, and perhaps because of coronavirus, people are at home, they're watching the news, they're on social media in a way that they haven't been before. And they're wanting to engage in what is structural racism? Why does this pernicious thing keep reinventing itself over and over again? And what is white privilege? Challenging before, I mean, just a few months ago, it'd be very hard to talk in any purposeful way about white privilege. But what does it really mean? Well, the two things I think it's important to understand is that for most white people in a country like the UK, given that, remember, the Black population here in the UK is just 3%, for most white people, you don't think about being white as a descriptor on a day-to-day basis. You're Jack or Fred or Sarah or Jill. But for most black and brown people, the reality of race is daily. The microaggressions, assumptions about your background, your intelligence, your point of view, the awkwardness you can feel if you walk into a shop and the security guards are looking at you. The moment when someone, usually a woman, crosses the road, when someone like me walks down on one side wearing my jogging suit, the moment when you're stopped and searched. And yes, even I have been stopped and searched. I was stopped and searched whilst being an MP. I was with my brother in a car. He's a magistrate. And we were both stopped by the police, surrounded with guns, told we met a description, and we were terrified in that moment. And that wasn't the first time. The first time for me was when I was 12, and I was patted down in a street by police officers on my own. I was told I met the description of a mugger, and I was so scared that I wet myself. Those stories are real, and people are beginning to say, we're hearing colleagues, we didn't understand that that was your daily experience. And there's a sort of revelation about that. And clearly, white privilege is the understanding that it's a privilege not to have to think about your race. Let me just say also, obviously as a Labour politician, that class is very real in this country. Deprivation is very real in this country, whatever the colour of your skin. And it is not to suggest that there are not many people in the country who are poor, who are white working class, who are struggling. It's simply to suggest that race is not one of the things that makes their life harder. And then we've got that BAME box. And this moment challenges that slightly because it's about the black of BAME. And it's about saying, I don't want to be an adjective anymore. I'm real, I'm a person, I want you to understand my story. And I want this country to recognize its history and this historic moment. And that's a huge challenge. What does it really mean in practice? Well, it means these uncomfortable conversations. It means recognizing that, like everything in public and political life, this moment too will pass and the news cycle will move on. And the question, I think, for your organization or corporation is, are you still in the business of race and Black Lives Matter? Or was this a momentary fad that passed? It needs sustained leadership. And leadership means targets in your organization, targets that may be missed, but nevertheless objectives that you've set yourself, KPIs that you can follow. It means when you're interviewing, challenging those who recruit for you, where is the diversity? It does mean positive action and positive discrimination. And here's the challenge when people say it's got to be on merit. The great story of the 20th century is a story about people at the beginning of the century that had no rights at all. Working class people down pits, down mines, factory floors, who because of the Labour Party, progressive forces, trade unions, certainly in our own country, had rights by the latter part of the 20th century. It's about black men and women who were colonized, and certainly I and others would not be on this webinar now were it not for people like Martin Luther King, Malcolm X and others who fought so hard to get us to this point. And of course, it's about women. Women who couldn't own their own bodies, were the property of their fathers or their husbands. And because of people like Emily Pankhurst and the suffragettes, had rights by the end of the 20th century. And if you were LGBTQ, let's not even go there. The ability to love who you want to love was not ever accepted. And it's only recently, relatively speaking, that same-sex marriage has been adopted through much of the developed world. And it's because of so many forces and struggle, we used to call it struggle, not diversity and inclusion, struggle by people like Mandela to get us to this point. And the truth is, it's extraordinary that the early part of the 21st century, much of this is up for debate. we have populist nationalist leaders in countries like the United States for whom much of this is up for debate. And so it turns out that for all those rights won, leadership is required. And so when people say it's got to be on merit, my answer to that is, why is it that merit is always interpreted as white, middle class, and male? I've met many white middle class men that have got great jobs, and it wasn't on merit. It's because they knew someone who knew someone. Or they were fortunate to go to a certain kind of school from the age of 7, and then to a certain kind of university, and come out in a sort of polished way. So leadership is, to some extent, about positive action at this moment. We wouldn't have all those women in the House of Commons, in all political parties, by the way, unless leaders like David Cameron and like Tony Blair had said, enough is enough, we're going to preference women, because if we leave it to the old system, it will always produce men. And leadership requires being sustained about it, not just bringing people into the organization, but mentoring them when they're there, with the humility to understand that you learn as much from them as they learn from you. And that mentoring has got to come from right at the top of the organization, the directors. And you've got to bring people on. You've got to say to them, I'm determined that you're a director one day, or a partner, or whatever the model is in your particular company or organization. Until we've got you there, we failed. Until we've kept you there, we failed. When someone leaves, why are you leaving? What's the 360? What's the feedback loop? Maybe it's anonymous across Black or BLM employees in your company. What are their hopes and expectations? What are their real experiences? That's what this moment calls for. And anyone on this call has power. And if you're an ally in this fight, if you agree with me on those progressive forces, then remember that the word ally is a verb. It's active. It means doing, not just talking. It means using that power to affect change. So I think that's the challenge of this moment. We can rise to it. The millennials and Generation Y are requiring it of us. So if you want to sit back, you can sit back for a little period, but I don't think it's going to be for very long. And I think there's a moment that's happening right across Europe particularly, where we're not getting to look across the pond at the United States, and because they've got guns, because they've got Donald Trump and all the rest of it, say, oh my God, their version of racism is worse than ours. A lot of this stuff started here. And our history in this country is more than just Henry VIII and our defeat of Hitler. There was much in between that is why our country is truly multicultural, and much that built this country. And one of the calls I've said is that, you know, whether it's the review that I led for David Cameron on the criminal justice system, whether it's Macpherson after the Stephen Lawrence murder and the policing, whether it's Baroness Ruby McGregor's review on the ethnicity pay gap and diversity in the workplace, or the Parker review on the diversity of boards, all of these recommendations, if they just sit there and gather dust, I'm afraid lead to deep cynicism and skepticism amongst Black and ethnic minority populations. And when that happens, people give up on people like me and they take to the streets, as we're seeing in the United States. And that's why we have now to act. And that challenge at this moment is bigger, it seems to me, than just challenge to government. It's challenge to private organizations as well as public organizations as well, which is why you're seeing so many organizations look into their history and commit to this, but also say what more actually at this moment can be done. Thank you.